Hey everyone, I'm Lianna Adams, and welcome back to the YRX podcast. DeFi was meant to revolutionize finance, but is it truly delivering or just another overhyped experiment? Today we're joined by Ada Vaughan, Senior Director of DeFi Partnerships at Stellar Development Foundation, to separate the hope from the hype. Welcome, Ada.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. So maybe we could start with your professional background and, a little bit of your journey.
Absolutely. I caught the crypto bug in sort of 2017, 2018 timeframe. If anyone who's listening remembers the ICO craze of that era where token issuance was becoming a hot topic. And I started my career in marketing for financial services. At the time, I had an app that I was running for families to keep track of kids' household chores. It was a kind of random, like a lot of people in crypto. I had a kind of winding path to the industry. So I had stood up a debit card product, and I was looking for ways to represent value in the app that was non-US dollar. So this was in the US at the time. I was getting a lot of inquiries from families around the world saying, "Oh, what do I do if I want Australian dollars? I want British pounds." And so I was pursuing the idea of crypto to tokenize value in my app, and that's how I got interested in it. I ran across a gentleman who was working at a firm called Bread Wallet, which later was called BRD, a self-custody wallet that got to about, I don't know, 8 or 10 million users. I think it was quite large. And I started talking with him, and he wanted me to consult on the debit card space. In the meantime, I was learning a ton about crypto. And so we collaborated, and I ended up joining BRD to run partnerships for them. So that was my first job in crypto. And I learned so much about different chains, about custody, self-custody, and DeFi wasn't even a topic then, didn't even exist. So that's how I got started. And I've worked for a series of companies. Now I'm at Stellar, which is a layer one blockchain built for real world payments. So you might ask, why am I doing DeFi at Stellar? Last year, Stellar launched Soroban smart contracts, which enabled the kind of growth of these DeFi protocols and tooling that has just exploded in popularity. So it's really exciting to be leading DeFi partnerships at Stellar. And I've learned a lot through my work at Conduit, at Code Arena, some other amazing companies that are in the Web3 space and touch DeFi protocols closely.
Wow. I mean, I always love, hearing people's journey, right? And your journey is just amazing, and especially in DeFi as well, right? So, DeFi has been described as a revolution in finance. How would you personally define its value proposition?
I think DeFi is valuable because it allows participation from an exponentially bigger group of people. I love this idea of sort of peer-to-peer lending at scale or new investment opportunities. And it's very unbiased, right? Smart contracts are unbiased lenders. And I think this is a really, really interesting value proposition in a world where access to credit is very asymmetrical. People in emerging markets, people using different currencies, even small and medium-sized businesses. There are lots of reports about access to credit being a limiting factor for those businesses. So I think DeFi does have the opportunity to revolutionize finance for these real-world use cases.
Yeah, I think I love hearing about the different use cases, right? So, how much progress has DeFi made in bridging the gap between the tech savvy crypto community and the average financial consumer?
Okay, this is a good question. Like, not a whole lot is the honest answer. There is still a huge gap, and it's primarily, I think, a gap in trust. People trust their financial institution they've been using for years. They have like a leap to make to understand how DeFi works. So for the average financial consumer, I don't know. I don't know if the average person knows much about DeFi or cares. But I do see a lot of progress in the B2B realm, particularly related to lending in emerging markets. And there's some consumer lending too. It's less visible. It's more abstracted from the user. So maybe they don't even know DeFi is involved. There's an application called Meru that is built on Stellar that accesses others' interest on their accounts by accessing a DeFi protocol called Blend. And so this is a real world example on Stellar where DeFi is touching those consumers, but they may not realize that it's DeFi or call it that. On the B2B side, I think there's more knowledge because the numbers are bigger and there's more to gain in terms of trade finance, supply chain financing, these kinds of use cases where speed is so important and having a very mobile, easy to transfer currency is so helpful.
Yeah, and I think when it's the B2B first, it somehow kind of build some trust, I guess, and then it'll trickle down to the consumer, right? And like you said, maybe some of these consumers don't even know that it's called DeFi. So what metrics or milestones would you say determine whether DeFi is succeeding or failing?
This is another very good question. I was talking with a colleague about this question, like, how do we know, right, if it's working, like if DeFi is a force for good? I would say in a broad view, I look at volume and TVL. So DeFi Llama is a site that is aggregating information about the industry, and it's fairly reliable, especially in terms of the bigger numbers. And so I think you can look at, for example, like the lending category on DeFi Llama. It's about 50 billion right now. So about 50 billion in TVL. That's the amount of value that's locked in smart contracts securing live loans, borrowing and lending activity. And it's a pretty big number, but I think more interesting is the growth. Like Aave, for example, is a very well known, it's the top lending protocol on DeFi Llama. Aave reached about 1 billion in TVL in 2020. Today is about 20 billion. So in the lending category, about 40% of the lending category is occupied by Aave. This is a really strong statistic for me to point to and say, this is getting used, this is growing, it's valuable. Also, I look at like trade finance numbers. What does this market look like? There's so much room to run in terms of helping companies with trade finance friction. I think over $9 trillion in trade finance is about the size of the market in 2024. This is a very large amount of value. And so I look at this and I look at, what volume of trade finance flows could be helped by DeFi. And eventually I think these things will converge.
Yeah, those are pretty big numbers, and I didn't realize how big the numbers are. That's amazing. Do you think DeFi has delivered on its promise of financial inclusion, or is it still too inaccessible for most people?
I think it's starting to. I mentioned Meru earlier. There's another product called Decaf that has a great story, again, built on Stellar, or products like Etherfuse, which are tokenizing bonds. I think that DeFi, in the sense of tokenization, is just starting to bring products, especially to emerging markets that before were very constrained by their borders. So I'm a U.S. resident. I have access to T-bills. There's interest-bearing accounts. Like all these products are pretty much available to me. And by the way, I can keep all my value in U.S. dollars. But if I live in Argentina or I live in, a place in Latin America or another country where my home currency is not so stable, I guess that's a great understatement, then getting access to dollars is step one. And we can do that with stable coins. Beyond that, how can I grow that value? Well, now if I have a tokenized T-bill or if I have a product that aggregates U.S. stock value or real estate investment, these kinds of things can offer better access to financial products globally. And so I think that part of financial inclusion is starting to be offered. DeFi specifically, so those are all examples that are kind of leading up to DeFi. I think DeFi's promise of financial inclusion is still to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think also with financial inclusion, every continent and every country is slightly different, right? The needs are different. Um, so yeah, I think we still kind of have a long way to go, but I think, it won't be long as well, right? With DeFi kind of still plagued by scams, hacks, and regulatory scrutiny. Do you think these challenges are inherent to the space, or are they just growing pains?
I think they're inherent to any financial product. I mean, hacks are an unfortunate reality for any financial institution, for credit cards, for, basically anywhere that there's value to be stolen is going to draw the attention of bad actors who will attempt to steal it. I think regulatory scrutiny is actually good from my perspective. Having regulators take a look at these products and decide how they can protect consumers is a positive thing. And it's the only way that these products will become more accessible and more mainstream.
Yeah, because like in the Web3 space, there's also a lot of talk, like they don't want regulations, and like they think the regulators are going to just screw everything up, right? So, how do you respond to critics who say DeFi is just an experimental sandbox for tech enthusiasts with little practical application for the real world?
I love this question. For certain, there's experimentation and crypto native dApps, and you see all of these like very interesting things going on with sort of algorithmic lending and assets. But if you look at this subset of DeFi that we call PayFi applications, which is part of the DeFi realm, payment finance applications, these are totally practical and really valuable use cases. One example is a company called Polyflow, and they have a system they created on Stellar called Pelago that is a supply chain financing flow, basically tokenizing invoices so that suppliers can be paid faster and companies can borrow funds to keep their supply chain running. And it's super useful because it allows for new flows of capital as well. So you have these new sources of capital, people who are willing to lend because of the transparency of blockchain. And then there absolutely are PayFi and DeFi applications that have practical application that are helping businesses get to market faster. They're getting shipments on the water faster, and they're saving the fees of intermediaries that used to exist in that process.
Yeah. So, and another thought is that DeFi was meant to remove the middleman, right? But some platforms now act like banks. Is DeFi really decentralized anymore, you think?
DeFi, yeah. Some people say DeFi is a misnomer, right? Like, or they'll say CeFi, CeFi, there's like all the different terms that you can throw in there. I would say that many stablecoin issuers are centralized, like asset issuers like Circle, for example, right? This USDC or Circle coin asset travels on a bunch of different blockchains, including Stellar. Those issuers have a lot of power because the more those assets get used, the more real world assets they're holding in reserve, and they're making money on the reserve. So there's kind of tension between this. There's a desire for trust and control, like in the case of a stablecoin reserve, is one example. But there's also a desire for decentralization and fairness. And so I think there are parts and pieces. I think the reality is that DeFi is creating parts and pieces of financial infrastructure that do, through decentralization, that do provide new capabilities and new value. But is the entirety of DeFi really, truly decentralized? It's not, because there still are, points where we have to do KYC, for example, or points in the flow where we have to go offline and evaluate an asset, whether that's, assessing a piece of real estate or assessing the risk, doing underwriting on a grouping of invoices or something like this. So financial instruments, I think, like there's still some of this centralized human component in some of the flows. But what I'm excited about is the points in the process that are made so much more efficient and better through DeFi.
Yeah, and also sometimes, being centralized is not bad at all, right? And especially if it comes from the Web3 side, where people would instill or imbue the ethos of Web3, right? So somehow I also feel like just because it's slightly centralized, it's not a bad thing.
Yes.
If DeFi achieves mainstream adoption, what fundamental changes will we see in how individuals and businesses approach finance?
I think they're already starting to be more efficient, faster flows of value. So whether that means getting an invoice paid in real time, T+0 settlement on a payment, or whether that be a business payment or funding a loan or transferring peer-to-peer, especially cross-border, same-day remittances, things like this are pretty exciting. I think there'll be better access to credit, and this is specifically on the point of DeFi, especially in emerging markets, because these sorts of financial instruments that allow for lending, and as you can tell, that's one of my favorite use cases for DeFi, is this sort of borrowing and lending piece. You can have such much more efficiency and such greater participation. Therefore, the risk is spread out. Loans can be smaller, and small loans, micro lending, is super impactful in emerging markets, but it's very hard to do because of the administrative burden. So I think better access to credit is another thing. And finally, I think that if DeFi achieves mainstream adoption, we'll see even more use of stablecoins, especially in trade finance. Stablecoins are kind of the linchpin of DeFi. Like, you really need them in order to facilitate these flows.
Wow, thank you so much for that. That's amazing. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'll add one more thing, which is, for the listening audience, which is probably pretty diverse in terms of their level of experience. This is not financial advice, but a general advice to say, read the fine print, do your research. For anyone who's considering participating in a crypto native DeFi protocol, make sure you understand how that protocol works. Where does the yield come from? Where does this interest come from? And what the risks might be to the funds that you're putting in before you jump in.
That's such great advice. Thank you so much for that. So yeah, what's the verdict on DeFi? A real game changer, or just another trend? Whatever the case, it's clear that the space is evolving and we're all watching closely. Big thanks to Ada Vaughan for sharing her insights today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and join the conversation. I'm Lianna Adams, and I'll catch you next time on the WireX podcast.